there aren't really any magic words. That it seems that the world is broken and the country is warped by distortions, and it can be easy to shut down. And I don't really want to shut down. But it's important to mitigate the constant onslaught of tragic information. And for me, I continue to learn to sense when I'm overwhelmed and when I'm merely, reactively sort of closing myself off. And a heart that's shut down can't receive anything. So there's, so much going on. My friend had a baby, and Bill and I have been having some sometimes challenging conversations, and someone I know went to the prom, and I felt happy most of this week, and I felt the love and support of friends, and we'll be having a birthday party next week. I'm confused about some things, and the birds were singing outside, the rain was falling. I just aspire to keep my heart open to it all. And I hope that you also do what you need to stay grounded and safe and open. Because for me, it's mindfulness that really keeps my heart open and keeps me aware in all of this busyness of our world now. And Sati, the ancient Pali word that's translated as mindfulness, I mean, during the Victorian era, that era took these complex Buddhist concepts and gave us these riveting translations like suffering and aggregates and sympathetic joy. And in some ways, mindfulness is a great translation for that word, Sati. But it speaks to us, it has, sometimes mindfulness is sort of a misnomer, that Sati is ultimately about training and increasing our overall capacity to be with life in a more easeful and non-reactive way. The Satipatthana Sutta is instructions, training for increasing our capacity to be with life with more ease, to experience freedom in any moment, regardless of what's happening. And quite often, the body can be a good place for this training. And that's why the breath and the body are objects for meditation in so many traditions. One of the connotations for Sati is memory, not in the sense of recalling information or having a memory of the past, but the actual act of remembering. So often during meditation, my mind wanders. It happens to all of us. And when I come back into my body, my place where my seat is on the cushion, or where my hands are touching, or where my arms are touching part of my body, or sometimes even how my lips touch. When I come back to my breath and the present moment, then I remember, oh yeah, duh, I was meditating. That's what I was doing, because, we forget these things. And that very precise moment of remembering, of awareness, that is Sati. That moment that we wake up in that present moment and come back to the present. And when I'm remembering to be fully in this moment, to feel my breath, my body, to feel my existence. It's interesting because to dismember means to pull the body apart piece by piece. And maybe with meditation practice, I'm remembering. I'm getting out of my head, and I'm coming to my senses, to each of the sense doors, cultivating an embodied awareness, of sight at the eye door, sound at the ear door, taste at the taste door, touching at the where the body touches, thoughts, thinking at the thought door, putting my body back together, breath by breath. And it took me time to learn to do this in meditation. Like many of us, I lost connection to my body probably early on in adolescence. And a kind of self-consciousness came about during the changes that I went through. And I think that I began thinking of my body more of an object, like more of an object than a subject. In fact, I think also growing up female that we begin confusing, alternating between exhibiting and hiding our bodies. And it wasn't until I started doing yoga in my early 20s that I started to reconnect my body. And I think through yoga and through dance and other movements that I began to learn where I carry stress and tension in my body and where I can find and cultivate ease. And I began to understand that kind of contraction and tension in my mind, and it has an effect on my body, and that my body affects my mind. There have been times also when I've had illnesses, and my main meditation practice was lying down, sometimes lying down on the floor. Helps my body release tension more easily and sense my body in relationship to the earth, that everything softens sometimes when I lay down. And I feel more grounded, more relaxed, and more open sometimes. And so learning to cultivate and allowing ease in the body is an ongoing challenge for us, especially as we get older too. But it's vital to our well-being, especially in times of great stress. And throughout the day, it's a moment-to-moment practice of coming back to sensations, to feeling my seat, to taking a deep breath, and to opening my heart. And the body is where we remember that we're vital and beautiful and capable of love, capable of tenderness and capable of sorrow and of wonder and of joy. The Buddha spoke about the power of mindfulness in a very emphatic way. He said just outright, mindfulness, I declare, is all helpful, and all things can be mastered by mindfulness, in the Anguttara Sutta. And there's also this sort of solemn and weighty utterance that's the opening and the concluding of the Satipatthana Sutta, which we've been talking about in our Tuesday class, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness. And he says, in this way, O monks, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the destruction of pain and grief, for reaching the right path, for the attainment of freedom, namely the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And, in ordinary life, if mindfulness or attention is directed to any object, it's rarely sustained long enough for the purpose of really carefully and having real observation. because generally it's followed immediately by an emotional reaction, a discriminative thought, a reflection, or a purposeful action. In a life and thought governed by the Buddhist teachings too, mindfulness, or Sati, is mostly linked with clear comprehension, sampajana, of the right purpose or the suitability of an action and other considerations. So there too, it's not really viewed in itself, but to tap the actual potential power of mindfulness. It's necessary to understand and deliberately cultivate it in its basic, pure form that is often called bare attention. And by bare attention, we understand the clear and single-minded awareness of what actually happens to us and in us at each successive moment of perception when conditions come together. And it's called bare because it attends to the bare facts of what we perceive without reacting to them by an action or a mental comment or speech. And ordinarily that pure receptive state of mind is just a brief phase of the thought process that often we're, really very scarcely aware of. But in this methodical development of mindfulness that's aimed at the unfolding of these latent powers of freedom, bare attention is sustained for as long a time as we have strength or concentration, as long as concentration permits. So bare attention becomes the key to that meditative practice of satipatthana, opening the door to the mind's mastery, really, to final liberation, to nibbana. So bare attention becomes the key to that practice, which is why we just keep returning without having perception attached to what's happening in the moment. And so we can develop it in two ways, as this methodical meditative practice that selects objects like the breath, or constantly changing objects that arise at the sense doors. And it can also be applied, as you hear me talk about plenty, where it's practicable to be normal events of the day, together with a general attitude of mindfulness and clear comprehension there in our day-to-day activities. I'm sure that happens to us when we're on any task, that any task in our daily life, that if we can have mindfulness and clear comprehension around what's happening in our daily life, then we're practicing bare attention and mindfulness. I recently picked up one of my actually favorite little books that can be found free as a PDF from BuddhaNet, which is one of my favorite websites. It's The Power of Mindfulness, and it's by Nanaponika Thera, who has written some amazing books. He's a wonderful translator. And it's an inquiry into the scope of bare attention and the principal sources of its strength. And he mentions these 4 sources of the power in bare attention. And he calls them the mainsprings of the power of mindfulness. They're not only sources of strength, but they're the principal ones that can help the method of mental development really become more efficient. So the four, that the way he refers to them, is the function of tidying up and naming, exercised by bare attention, and that it's non-violent and non-coercive in the practice. We're not pushing ourselves. And the capacity of stopping and slowing down, and the directness of vision that comes about because of bare attention. And so those functions of tidying and naming, tidying up our mental household, so to speak, I think we know that anyone whose mind is not harmonized and controlled through this sort of methodical, meditative training needs to take a closer look at their everyday thoughts and activities, and that we will meet with a rather sort of disconcerting sight that, apart from a few main purposeful thoughts and activities, that everywhere we're faced with this tangled mass of perceptions and thoughts and feelings and body movements and all kinds of disorderliness and confusion that, you know, we wouldn't tolerate that in our living rooms, and yet it's a state of affairs that we take for granted with a lot of our waking life and our normal mental activity. And so if we look at the details of this, what he calls untidy picture, first we meet with a number of causal sense impressions, sights, sounds, passing constantly through our mind. And most of them are sort of vague and fragmented, and some are, we might notice that they're even based on faulty perceptions or misjudgments. You've heard me use that example before of perception, where the guy who was building his house, and he saw these blue herons, and he was sure that the chirping noise in his basement was the chirping of blue herons making a little nest in his basement. So, you know, his perception was pleasant. And then later, when he had to get a contractor over to do something in his basement, the contractor said he had this constant chirping that was going off that was his fire system alarm. And so now all of a sudden, what seemed to be perceived as something, you know, positive, now was perceived as something negative that had to be fixed right away. And so, you know, we sometimes have faulty perceptions of things and misjudgments, and we carry these sort of weaknesses from kind of an untested basis sometimes for judgments and decisions on higher levels of consciousness. And it's true that the causal sense impressions don't and can't be objects for focused attention. You know, a stone on the road that happens to meet our glance will have a claim on our attention only if it obstructs our progress or it interests us for some reason, like it's a pretty stone. But if we neglect causal impressions too often, we might stumble over many stones lying on the road and overlook many gems. Besides the causal sense of impressions, there's more significant and definite perceptions, thoughts, feelings, volitions that have a closer connection with our purposeful life. And here too we can find a really high proportion of them in a state of utter confusion. Hundreds of cross currents flash through the mind, and everywhere there are these bits and ends of unfinished thoughts and stifled emotions and passing moods, and many of them meet sort of a premature death because they arise, and they have sort of a feeble nature, and they pass away, and our concentration, or maybe we have some newer, stronger impressions that are arising, and they don't persist and they don't develop. And if we observe our own minds, we can notice how easily diverted our thoughts are, and how often they behave like undisciplined, children, just constantly being all over the place. Kids interrupting each other and refusing to listen to the other one's side of the argument. And, lots of times there are things that are just sort of left in the mind untranslated, and it becomes an action of some kind. And if we continue to examine more closely these average perceptions that we have, thoughts or judgments, we have to admit that many of them are not very reliable. They're just products of habit. I was speaking with somebody today about just the habits, the products of habits that arise in our minds that make us maybe a doubtful person, or make us think that we're a person who's depressed a lot, or unhappy, or we can't get what we want, or, but these are very unreliable thoughts that sometimes they're just created by intellect or emotion, and we have preferences and aversions, and we get sort of lazy or maybe selfish. We just keep attaching to the same impressions about ourselves. And when we look into this long neglected portion of the mind, it can sometimes come, I think, as a shock to our observing mind, to the observer, that we see this sometimes urgent need for some kind of a methodical method that we have to skip over that thin surface layer and look deeper and clearer with bare attention as to what's arising and passing. And so in his book, he mentions that, or it's a PDF really, it's a booklet, he mentions that the dark, untidy corners of the mind are like hideouts of our most dangerous enemies. From there, they attack us unawares, and much too often succeed in defeating us. That twilight world, peopled by frustrated desires and suppressed resentments, by vacillations, whims, and many other shadowy figures, form a background from which usurping passions, greed and lust, hatred and anger may derive powerful support. And I can see this just in like waking up from a nap, when there are so many varieties of things arising in my mind that I've some sort of unaware of, and so many emotions and thoughts that go running through to influence, oh, I don't really want to wake up yet. Or the mood of the mind upon waking might be something in confusion, or something in anxiety, or something that feels really bogged down and maybe, in depression. And it's like all of these states of mind come and go. And that's where, bare attention, seeing things clearly just as they are, without, or noticing when the very next moment arises that I have a perception about it, or opinion about it, or I like it, or I don't like it. But the bare attention on it. I try to make these attempts to eliminate the mind's main defilements of greed and hatred and delusion. And they can't really find refuge and support in these, uncontrolled, dimmed regions of the mind, as long as there's a little bit of clarity to, the importance of mindfulness. And nothing more difficult is needed, I don't think, than to acquire the habit of directing bare attention to these thoughts as soon as possible. The working principle is the simple fact that two thoughts can't exist at the same time. Sometimes it's hard to believe that because we multitask so much. But really, two thoughts can't coexist at the same time. And if the clear light of mindfulness is present, there isn't any room for this kind of mental twilight. And when sustained mindfulness can have a more secure, firm foothold, then it's a matter of how the mind will then deal with these thoughts, these moods and emotions, and we might just dismiss them. Let them go. They're unskillful. We can just let them go and replace them with more purposeful thoughts. We might even allow and even compel them to complete what they have to say, but in that case, they often reveal how poor and weak they actually are. And then it's not difficult to disperse them once they're sort of looked at, forced out into the open. And that's where this process of bare attention is simple and effective. And the difficulty is only the persistence in applying it. And I have to say, quite often, my persistence is, sort of shaky, not so persistent. So I think that's kind of enough for now to say about the sort of methodical idea of applying bare attention to what is arising and to noticing, what happens when we feel sort of foggy. How soon or when can we notice that maybe those thoughts can just be let go of, or maybe they need to be seen in the open, but we can notice that they, with our attention, without our preferences and without the perception of it's good or bad, but it's just seen clearly, then we can see that it arises and passes away. So I think I'll ask you to talk to me about what you notice, if you feel like sharing anything. Applying mindfulness to those times where maybe the mind is in confusion, or those tangled deep corners that just keep showing up with all these shadowy figures that we can't quite recognize. And when we're willing to, when do we divert our attention, which we do plenty with lots of diversions. When do we look at it and see that there's an advantage to seeing things clearly and having bare attention? So I'm going to take a minute here to turn my speaker back on.